The first time I saw her, she was already erasing my mother. Not with malice, but with a quiet, systematic efficiency that was somehow worse. Her name was Clara, and within a month of marrying my grieving father, she had convinced him to redecorate the master bedroom. The soft lilacs and creams my mother had loved were replaced with stark, minimalist grays. Clara's colors. When the boxes arrived, I saw the monogram on her new luggage, Ch. Clara Harrington. She had taken his name, swallowed his identity, and was in the process of digesting his life. My father, a once vibrant history professor named Arthur, seemed to shrink under her care. He called her "my dear Clara" in a voice that sounded rehearsed. His laughter, once a booming, infectious sound, became a polite, measured chuckle. She hadn't just taken his name, she was slowly annexing his soul. My revenge began not with a plan, but with a rescue mission. I couldn't attack her directly. She was too clever, her control too subtle. I had to remind him of who he was, to reawaken the heart she was methodically putting to sleep. I started with music. My father was a closet Beatles fanatic, a secret he'd shared with my mother. They'd had dance parties in the kitchen to "twist and shout." Clara deemed it juvenile noise, and their old records were banished to the garage. One afternoon when she was out, I dragged the old turntable inside, dusted off Abbey Road, and dropped the needle. The opening chords of "Come Together" filled the house. My father, grading papers in his study, went still. He didn't come out, but I saw his door crack open. He was listening. The next week, I accidentally spilled coffee on the bland abstract art Clara had hung in the living room. While it was at the restorer's, I dug out an old, slightly faded map of the Roman Empire he and my mother had bought on their honeymoon. He spent an entire evening tracing the routes with his finger, a distant smile on his face. Clara frowned at the clutter, but said nothing. I was planting seeds, watering the parched ground of his former self. But Clara was a skilled gardener, too, and she was planting weeds of doubt. "He's becoming so sentimental, so stuck in the past," I heard her tell him one evening. "It's not healthy, Arthur. You need to look forward." My revenge needed a final, undeniable flourish. I remembered the journals. My mother, a writer, had kept them for years. Clara, in her crusade against the past, had boxed them up for the attic. I knew my father hadn't had the heart to read them after she died. I chose the volume from the year I was born. I didn't give it to him. I left it, bookmarked with a ribbon, on his favorite armchair. The bookmark held a passage I had carefully selected. My mother's words, in her looping script, described the moment she knew she loved him. It's not in the grand gestures, but in the way his whole face lights up when he talks about the fall of Constantinople. It's in his heart, that big, ridiculous, brilliant heart. I hope I never tame it. I hid in the hall and watched him find it. He sank into the chair, reading. His shoulders, usually so tense under Clara's gaze, slumped. Then, they shook. He wasn't sobbing, he was weeping, a deep cleansing release. He was remembering the man my mother had loved. The man Clara was trying to tame. He didn't confront her that night. But the next morning, something had shifted. When Clara tried to steer him toward buying a new, more prestigious car, he gently disagreed. "I like my old Volvo," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It has character." It was a small rebellion, but it was a start. My revenge wasn't about her downfall. It was about his resurrection. She had taken his name. But I had reminded him that his heart was his own. And as I watched him slowly reclaim the pieces of himself, I knew I was winning. The real Arthur Harrington was stirring. And no amount of minimalist gray or calculated control could put him back to sleep. The small rebellion of the Volvo was a crack in the dam. I watched, my breath held, to see if the pressure would hold or if the whole structure of Clara's control would come crashing down. It held, but the leak was persistent. My father began spending more time in his study. Not with the dry academic texts Clara approved of, but with the old, leather-bound history books that smelled of dust and passion. He started humming Beatles tunes under his breath while making coffee. Clara's smiles grew tighter, her movements more precise. As if she could physically nail down the floorboards that were shifting beneath her feet. I knew I had to widen the crack. My next move was more direct, more dangerous. It was Clara's birthday. She had planned a small, elegant dinner party. A showcase for her refined taste and her successful annexation of Professor Arthur Harrington. The guest list was a who's who of university brass and their equally polished spouses. The evening arrived. The house was impeccable, the silver gleamed. And Clara was the picture of poised control in a severe black sheath dress. My father wore the suit she had laid out for him, looking like a dignified hostage. As dessert was served, Clara stood, tapping her crystal flute with a spoon. "A toast," she announced, her voice silky. "To my husband, Arthur. The brilliant mind, the steady hand. May our future continue to be as ordered and prosperous as the present." It was the perfect, sterile speech. It celebrated his utility, not his soul. As the polite applause died down, I stood up. All eyes turned to me. Clara's gaze was a silent warning. "I'd like to make a toast as well," I said, my voice slightly too loud. Feigning a youthful earnestness, I raised my glass to my father. To Dad. To the man who taught me that history isn't just dates and facts. It's the story of people. Passionate, messy, glorious people. I looked directly at him, ignoring the frozen smile on Clara's face. To the man who cried at the end of Gladiator and who once spent a whole summer trying to build a trebuchet in the backyard. To the biggest heart I've ever known. The room was utterly silent. You could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. I had just described a man none of these people knew. A man Clara had carefully dismantled and stored away. My father's eyes met mine. For a moment, he looked startled, exposed. Then, something in his face softened. A genuine, weary, but real smile touched his lips. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. Clara's composure didn't break, but it fissured. The smile remained on her face, but it didn't reach her eyes, which had gone as cold and hard as the diamonds at her ears. "How sentimental," she said, her voice dropping a dangerous octave. The spell of her perfect evening was broken. The conversation that resumed was stilted, the guests glancing between my father, me, and Clara with newfound curiosity. The mask of the perfectly managed household had slipped. Later, as the last guest left, Clara turned to my father. Her voice was low and venomous. "Your son deliberately embarrassed us tonight. He made a spectacle of you. Made you look like a sentimental fool." My father was taking off his tie, looking more tired than I'd ever seen him. He didn't look at her. He looked at his own reflection in the dark window. "No, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "He didn't embarrass me." He finally turned to her, and in his eyes, I saw the ghost of the man who had tried to build a trebuchet. He reminded me of who I am. He walked out of the room, leaving her standing alone in the spotless silent aftermath of her party. The revenge was no longer a covert operation. It was an open declaration of war for my father's soul. And for the first time, he had chosen a side. He had chosen his heart. The silence after the party was a different creature than the one that had come before. This was not the quiet of suppression, but the tense, humming stillness of a battlefield after the first, decisive shot has been fired. My father had chosen a side. He had chosen his heart. Clara did not take his defiance lying down. The following days were a masterclass in cold warfare. Meals were served in silence. The temperature in the house seemed to drop several degrees. She began a new campaign of erasure, this one more aggressive. She packed away the old map of the Roman Empire, claiming it needed to be professionally preserved. She accidentally broke the vintage turntable needle, rendering the Beatles' records silent once more. But her most insidious move was psychological. She began to reframe the narrative. "Arthur, you're not yourself," she'd say, her voice dripping with faux concern. "You've been so fragile since your son's little outburst. It's stirred up all that old grief. It's unhealthy." She was pathologizing his awakening, trying to convince him that the return of his own personality was a symptom of mental decline. I saw the doubt creep back into his eyes. The trebuchet-building historian was a memory, and Clara was expertly painting him as a destabilizing force. My revenge, which had felt so triumphant, was now in danger of being twisted into a weapon against him. I couldn't fight her with memories alone. I needed to give him something tangible, something in the present that was unequivocally his. I remembered the garden shed. Tucked in the back, under a dusty tarp, was my father's old wooden sailboat, a small, sleek daysailor he'd named the Inquisitive Mind. He and my mother had spent countless weekends on the water. Clara had called it a dangerous hobby and a waste of a weekend, shortly after they married. It hadn't been touched in years. The forecast for Saturday was perfect. Clear skies and a steady breeze. On Friday night, I went to work. I didn't ask for permission. I cleaned the hull, checked the rigging, and aired out the sails. It was hard, physical labor, and with every polish of the brass fittings, I felt like I was polishing a piece of his soul. Saturday morning, I went to his study. He was staring at a spreadsheet, but his eyes were distant. "Dad," I said, "the wind is perfect. The Inquisitive Mind is ready." He looked up, confusion, then a flicker of longing in his eyes. "The boat? Leo, I haven't. Clara has plans for us today." "Cancel them," I said, my voice firm. "This is your plan." The war played out on his face, duty to Clara's schedule versus the call of the open water. The self he had been versus the man she wanted him to be. I saw the moment the heart won. A slow, determined smile spread across his face, the first real one I'd seen in months. We spent the day on the water. He was a different man at the helm. His back was straight, his commands were crisp, and his laughter, that booming, infectious sound, returned, carried away by the wind. We didn't talk about Clara. We talked about tacking into the wind, about cloud formations, about the time my mother had fallen overboard and come up sputtering with laughter. When we returned, sunburned and smelling of salt and sea, Clara was waiting on the porch. Her face was a thundercloud. "You missed our reservation at the club," she said, her voice icy. My father looked at her, then at the boat, then back at her. The man who had just commanded the wind and waves was not the same man who bowed to her social calendar. "It was a prior engagement," he said calmly, and walked past her into the house. I had given him back his kingdom. Not the house, not his name, but the vast blue expanse of freedom. Clara had taken his name, but on the water, he had a different title, Captain. And he had just remembered how it felt to wear it. The revenge was no longer about reminding him of the past, it was about reclaiming his present. And he was finally, truly, at the helm. The sail had changed everything. It was a line drawn in the sand, or rather, in the water. My father, Arthur, walked with a new authority. A quiet confidence that Clara's frosty disapproval could no longer pierce. The house became a territory divided into spheres of influence. He reclaimed his study, not just as a physical space but as a mental one. Filling it once more with the books and maps Clara had deemed clutter. The sound of Beethoven, her preferred soundtrack for a controlled environment, was now often drowned out by the ragged glory of the Rolling Stones coming from behind his closed door. Clara, realizing direct assault had failed, shifted tactics. She became a ghost in the machine of the house, her resentment a subtle poison in the well. Meals were still prepared, but they were bland, joyless affairs. She would forget to pass on phone messages from his old sailing friends. She signed him up for a silent meditation retreat without his consent. A transparent attempt to re-isolate him. The war was now one of attrition. My revenge needed a final, decisive stroke. It wasn't enough for him to resist her. He had to actively choose a future that excluded her. I needed to show him that the world he thought he'd lost was still waiting for him. And that it was far brighter than the gray, airless prison Clara offered. The opportunity came with the annual University Fall Gala, the social event of the season. It was Clara's Super Bowl, a night where her role as the professor's elegant wife was performed. On the biggest stage, she had already bought a new, devastatingly chic gown and had been subtly pressuring my father for weeks about his speech, a dry, academic piece she had largely written for him, full of safe, soulless platitudes. The night of the gala, I watched my father get ready. He stood before the mirror, adjusting his bow tie, his face a mask of grim resignation. He looked like a man preparing for his own execution. I walked into his room. "You know," I said casually, "Drive. Evans was asking about you the other day." He paused, his hands still on the tie. Rachel Evans was the vibrant, brilliant archaeology professor who had been my mother's closest friend. Clara had systematically alienated her years ago. "Oh," he said, a flicker of interest in his eyes. "Yeah, she said she misses arguing with you about the Bronze Age collapse. Said nobody else has the guts to challenge her." I saw a spark ignite in the depths of his eyes. The spark of intellectual combat, of passionate debate. The very things Clara had methodically extinguished. At the gala, Clara was radiant, holding court, her laughter a calculated tinkle. My father stood beside her, smiling his polite, hollow smile. When he was called to the podium to give his speech, he walked up slowly. The printed pages of Clara's script in his hand. He looked out at the sea of faces, at Clara's expectant, proud gaze. He looked down at the speech. Then, he folded the pages and tucked them into his pocket. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Clara's smile tightened. "My wife has written me a very good speech," he began, his voice initially hesitant, then growing stronger. "It's all about the measured, steady progress of knowledge. But I'm a historian, and what history has taught me is that progress is rarely steady. It's messy. It's loud. It's driven by arguments, by passion. By people who are willing to challenge the accepted narrative." He then launched into an impromptu Electrifying talk about the very thing Rachel Evans had mentioned, the Bronze Age collapse. He spoke not from notes, but from memory and from the heart. He talked about fallen empires, about forgotten languages, about the enduring, chaotic, and beautiful resilience of the human spirit. It was the antithesis of everything Clara represented. It was messy, passionate, and utterly, breathtakingly brilliant. The applause was thunderous. People surrounded him afterward, their faces alight with the excitement of having seen the real Arthur Harrington, unleashed after years of captivity. I found Clara standing alone by the punch bowl, her untouched glass in her hand. She was staring at my father, who was laughing with a group of colleagues, his face animated, his hands gesturing wildly. She wasn't angry. She was defeated. She finally understood. She could have his name, his address, his public identity. But she would never, ever have his heart. It belonged to the past, to the future, to the messy, glorious chaos of a life fully lived. And it was forever beyond her carefully controlled grasp. The revenge was complete. He was free. The ride home from the gala was a silence louder than any applause. Clara sat stiffly in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the blurred lights of the city, her perfect evening in ruins. My father drove, one hand on the wheel, the other resting easily on his knee. The tension in the car was a physical thing, a wall of ice I could feel from the back seat. He didn't pull into the driveway of our house. Instead, he stopped the car at the end of the street, under the canopy of an old oak tree. "Clara," he said, his voice calm, final. "This isn't working." She turned to him slowly, her face a mask of cold fury in the dim light. "Because of that little performance? You humiliated me, Arthur." "No," he said, and there was a profound sadness in his voice, but also a deep, unshakable certainty. "I finally stopped humiliating myself. I've been living a performance you directed for years. The script, the set, the character, all yours. Tonight, I ad-libbed. And it felt more real than anything I've done since my first wife died." He spoke not with anger, but with the clarity of a man who had just discovered a fundamental truth. "You wanted a husband named Arthur Harrington. But you never wanted me. You wanted a title, a stable fixture in a well-ordered life. My heart, my passions, my messy history. You saw them as flaws to be corrected." I held my breath in the backseat, a silent witness to the final act of the revenge I had set in motion. "What are you saying?" Clara whispered, her voice stripped of all its calculated grace. "I'm saying that you can keep the name," he said, his gaze steady on her. "It's just a name. But I'm taking the rest of it back. My books, my music, my boat, my heart." He took a deep breath. "I want a divorce." The word hung in the air, simple and devastating. There were no tears, no screaming. Just the quiet shatter of a perfectly constructed world. Clara looked at him, and for the first time, I saw not a manipulator, but a woman who had gambled everything on building a life with a ghost and had lost. She had taken his name, but she had never earned his love. She moved out the next week. The house felt different instantly. The air was lighter. The silence was peaceful. My father and I didn't celebrate. We simply began the slow, quiet work of rebuilding. We hung the Roman Empire map back on the wall. We bought a new turntable needle. The sounds of life, real, uncurated life, filled the rooms once more. My revenge was never about hatred. It was a rescue. A long, patient campaign to unearth a buried man. I had used memory as a weapon, not to destroy, but to liberate. Clara had taken his name, but in the end, it was just a word on a deed. The heart, the brilliant, messy, beating heart of Arthur Harrington, was his alone again. And as I watched him, finally at peace in his own skin, I knew that was the only victory that ever mattered.